Hi, and welcome to the Grind Academy podcast. My name is Rob Patterson, and not so long ago, I traded my suits, my tuxedo, and a comfortable CEO lifestyle to become an entrepreneur. I now speak internationally. I've written a book, I created a clothing brand, and started the Grind Academy podcast. I started the podcast with one purpose in mind: to be a platform for sharing experiences and practical life skills not taught at school. Growing up, I relocated several times and often struggled to fit in at new places. My academic grades suffered, and eventually I finished school without a formal education. I did graduate, however, from the Academy of Life and eventually became CEO for one of Great Britain's largest hotel chains. It was practical life skills, learning to dream limitlessly, and consistent grind that guided me on my journey. That's why each week I'm introducing experienced and talented minds from sport, business, literature, and science who have gained invaluable life learnings. I want to share their stories as practical life lessons you can learn from and apply to your own personal situation. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Now let's hear about today's special guest. Episode 20, I'm joined by Mattice to discuss the really important topic of workplace intimidation or bullying in the workplace. Catherine is the founder of Civility Partners, a full-service HR consulting firm partnering with organisations across the globe to help build positive and respectful cultures and turn around toxic cultures. Catherine is also an international speaker, an author, and now a course instructor on LinkedIn. In our podcast, Catherine offers valuable leadership and workplace culture advice. Something I found really interesting was how willing a leader can be to change their style or not. An enormous part of leadership is self-awareness, and no matter how good someone is at generating results, I believe no company can afford the long-term costs of a toxic culture driven by an abrasive leader. When I first stepped into leadership, I was so focused on results that I was that abrasive leader. So a lot of what Catherine talks about, I could see in my younger self. Catherine's work is so important, and her message in this podcast is one all managers and leaders should listen to. So without further ado, let's meet Catherine. Catherine, welcome to the Grind Academy. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today. I wonder if we could just start by, could you share what a typical day looks like for you?
Well, a typical day is emotional, happy, sad. We work in a world of solving toxic work environments. So that's what we do. So we hear a lot of ugly stories from employees that make us sad, and we have a lot of success stories. So we get excited when we have those. So that's a typical day. It's an emotional roller coaster.
And how did you end up in this place? Were you bullied yourself? Did something drive you in this direction?
For sure. I was the director of human resources for an organization and found myself working with one other person. He was also a director, and I would say he engaged in bullying behavior. And as the director of HR, I was dealing with all of the complaints and organizational problems. And then I myself also felt bullied. So I was dealing with it as a target. And while I was working there, I decided to get my master's degree in organizational communication. And my very first semester, I had a class called The Dark Side of Communication. And it was about all things dark in human interaction, sibling rivalry, domestic violence, that kind of thing. And so, of course, I had to write a paper on a dark communication process. And I thought, well, I'm going to write about this person because I think it would be helpful to understand him. And it just blew up from there. I was so fascinated by all of the research I was reading, and I, came across this phrase, workplace bullying. It turns out there's about 40 years of academic research on the topic from around the world. And everything I did in graduate school was on that topic. I wrote my thesis on it, and pretty quickly after grad school wrote my first book. And I've been doing it ever since. It's solving the problem of workplace bullying and harassment.
You think, why is it a problem today still in our society? Why is it such a big problem?
That's a big, big question. One answer, there are a variety of answers. One is that I think the way we handle it is not the right way. So certainly harassment, for example, is illegal. bullying is legal in quite a few countries, including America. And so the behaviors are the same, but we're really dissecting them and separating them out. And so when we're dealing with harassment, we get really focused on the law. HR gets really focused on the compliance aspect of it. And yes, we need to do that, but that's not the whole story. You've also got to focus on building an inclusive work environment. And as we know, there are many people on this planet who do not feel included. So we've got a long way to go in making workplaces more inclusive. And as we move that needle, we will reduce harassment and bullying, I think.
If someone, I ran a company in the UK, but if there's plenty of people who watch this program who run their own companies. And I wonder if you were offering advice for somebody to, here's a set of steps that you should consider to start your journey in really becoming a truly open and inclusive environment, what would they be?
I think obviously it starts at the top. Leaders need to take a stand and be very clear that they will not tolerate behavior that's exclusive, from basic microaggressions and inappropriate sarcasm up to harassment. And so, leaders have to be very clear about that. And I think leaders, managers, supervisors, everyone needs to be more vulnerable at work too. That's another sort of problem around this, right? That we're not supposed to cry at work. You're not supposed to be vulnerable. Everything's focused on goals and objectives. But then if you're harassed or bullied or feeling excluded, that's a very vulnerable, emotional place to be. But hey, we're not allowed to have that type of a feeling at work, right? So I really think it's important that leaders demonstrate some vulnerability so that their employees feel more comfortable to talk about their vulnerabilities.
It's interesting that the 2 points that you went to there are both soft skills, and typically we overlook the soft skills. We kind of expect them of our leaders, but it's not always the case. And right. I wonder now, post-COVID, where we live in a world which some companies have gone entirely remote, some people have adopted a hybrid model. How much more difficult is that likely to be, or what impact do you think that will have on inclusivity or even bullying in the workplace?
I do think that one silver lining of COVID is that we all got a little more vulnerable together. We saw inside people's homes and that kind of thing, and people were stressed, and all of a sudden there's a lot of conversation around mental health. So I do think we're moving the needle on that vulnerability. I also know that COVID presented a lot of the risk factors that cause bullying and harassment. So for example, when in organizations with high stress, high competition, isolated workplaces, there's a variety of these risk factors that actually facilitate the opportunity for bad behavior to occur. And so we need to be more aware of that scenario as well. So the answer to your question is that we have to try harder. If you have a remote workforce or hybrid workforce, you're just going to have to work so much harder to get to an inclusive work environment. And but again, it comes from the top. If people feel comfortable to be themselves and be vulnerable, they're psychologically safe, that it's going to be a lot easier to build a relationship over Zoom than if, I'm afraid of you or afraid to speak my mind. So I think all of that is, it all works together.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I struggled with through the pandemic was the relationship side of things, simply because it's somebody sat at the end of a screen as opposed to somebody that you could have a conversation with in the canteen or whatever it might be. And that's, I guess, my concern or worries at that time were all about how do we maintain those soft skills in a remote world? And are there any practical things you think people or companies could adopt to, enhance or promote healthy relationships?
For sure. So I'll just share one thing that my team and I have been doing and continue to do now. We're on a Google Hangout all day, every day. So I'm here with you right now, but I'm going to get off and pop into my Google Hangout where my team is. And so there's often long periods of time where we're not really speaking, we're just doing our work, but it really emulates the being in an office, because then you get that funny email from the client or something happens or you have a quick question, you just say your question, so we are loving that we do that. And so we're together all day long, even though we're not together in person. So that's a big one that I've talked about a lot over COVID. I haven't really heard of others doing that. I've heard of other companies, for example, there's a nationwide marketing company I was talking to. They've done what they call geopods. So, there's clusters of employees in different parts of the US. So they've got somebody building up social meetups and things like that based on, so that, hey, everyone in this area come together. So there's things like that you can be doing. I think anything that brings people together, you could do a book club with your employees and then make time to talk about that at work. So it's about just making sure there's time to build relationships versus let's have a 10-minute Zoom call or a phone call. Okay, I'm moving on to the next thing. So slow down, build relationships into how you work.
Yeah, the Google Hangout one I hadn't thought of, but the book club, actually, we did that in my previous company. We had a book club and it was fantastic. It was, it brought people together on a social level, even though it was via a digital channel. I want to ask about the US, because this is kind of a big contrast that I see from Australia and from the UK. I was in the UK for the last 10 years. And something that it strikes me, I still can't wrap my head around it, is that companies have the ability to just let someone go within a week here. It's really not in the employee's favor. And, in the space of bullying, if the bullier happens to be your boss, they can just let you go. Mm-hmm. Is there something that needs to change from a policy point of view in the US, or do you think that's the right thing?
Well, yeah. So in America, harassment and bullying are the same exact behaviors. The only difference is who you aim them at. And so as long as the bullier is, bullying or harassing everyone, then they're well within their rights to do that. And that person is often seen as very valuable by the CEO, for example. And that person's usually a rainmaker of some sort. And so they're there. And unfortunately, what happens is the CEO is willing to forego all those people who quit or leave or what have you because of that rainmaker. So that is a huge problem. So yes, there are some policy issues, because if that same bullier, if HR were to come and say, this person's sexually harassing, here's some stories I've heard, that person would be gone in a minute. But it's that they're harassing people, but it's not sexual. It's not focused on race. And the CEO, for whatever reason, is all right with that. Right. So yes, the policies need to change. In fact, I'm the founder of a coalition called the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. And our current president wrote a bill called the Dignity at Work Act, which is actually focused on requiring employers to create a respectful work environment versus requiring employers to prohibit bad behavior. And that is a big change. So yeah, right now, someone who's being bullied there's no recourse for them. So yes, they can just be fired. And in fact, that's a pretty standard reaction by employers, is to fire the person being targeted.
Well, I had someone close to me actually last year, had exactly that situation. And even speaking to a lawyer, the lawyer said there's no recourse for you here in this situation. Yep. So I've seen that firsthand. And I guess I was stunned, because that could never happen in any of the countries that I've worked in before. And wonderful that you've been part of this organization that's tackling that topic, because, the worker really clearly, and I saw it firsthand, was so terribly treated.
So. Yeah. And there's so much research that people who feel bullied are experiencing depression, anxiety, PTSD has been associated with being bullied very quite frequently. If someone who's bullied definitely can develop symptoms. I've experienced talking to those people, and you can just feel the damage coming through the Zoom call, and they've just been destroyed for life. And just to your point about the UK and Australia, most of the research in workplace bullying comes from the UK, Australia, and Sweden. So you were in two countries that are very focused on solving workplace bullying, and the US just isn't.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask about your personal situation, if you don't mind me asking about it.
Sure.
You said that at one point in your career that you'd experienced bullying. And I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, we were both directors. We both reported directly to the president. He was a micromanager. He didn't fully understand my role in the organization. And so, because he didn't know what I was doing all day, every day, he was definitely kind of always poking his nose in my business. I was HR. So for example, I'd go to an HR association networking event and people told me that he'd be wandering around the office. Where's Catherine? Why isn't she here? Shouldn't she be here? It's like, it's none of your business. I'm doing what my boss gave me permission to do. He yelled. He definitely made it very clear if he didn't like somebody. So for example, we had a lunchroom and he might walk in and say hi to two of the people at the table and ignore the other three people, just blatant disrespect. And he really tried to control things. So if you didn't dot your I's and cross your T's, he was after you, and there was just no bending rules at all. If you weren't following the rules, he was after you. So it was very much focused on controlling. I also felt that he was insubordinate to the president. He would, the president would be giving some speech in our staff meeting and he would kind of go, that's not what we're doing. We already talked about that, and it just kind of this like, what are you talking about? And I always thought, well, that's interesting that the president doesn't say anything. But it turns out my scenario is very standard. So you have somebody who's controlling, high aggressive kind of a person. The leader is conflict avoidant and also sees that person as very valuable. So you get that combination and the rest is history. Anybody else who's in the way, they can be let go. In fact, the president I would say, another person in this guy's department's quitting. And the president would say, well, this was never going to be their career job anyways, like just kind of excuse, oh, that's fine. They can leave. I'm like, what's happening? So.
Yeah. Well, the experiences that I've had directly with bullying or even indirectly, I've always considered that even the bullier, the source of their bullying is often fear or emotions expressed through the form of bullying, and whether it's insecurities or fears or whatever it might be. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the bullier in the workplace.
For sure. So I actually specialize, one of the things that Civility Partners does, I specialize in coaching toxic leaders. So I do not coach regular leaders. I only coach toxic leaders. And so I can tell you all about them. So there's three things that make up a recipe for somebody to bully. The first is that they live in hyper fear and anxiety around competence. So you called it, they are deathly afraid that the world will see them as incompetent. And you add to that, I've noticed a pattern when I'm talking to my coaching clients that they've all been fighting for something. They're all fighters. So that's where that fear of incompetence comes from. Just to give you some examples, I coached a woman who was, older. So she was in medical school long before there were lots of female doctors. She was the only female in her class, not to mention a single mom of three. Nobody understood her struggles. She had to fight, right? I coached a woman who was a quality assurance manager at a pharmaceutical company. She came to this country not speaking any English and, fights her way to a PhD and having this big role. I coached a guy who was looking to get into the NFL from college football, so they all have a story like that where there's some fighting. And so that's where that fear of uber competence comes from. So those are the first two things. The third thing is obviously they lack social and emotional intelligence. So when they do freak out on someone, while most of us would go back and apologize or notice, the body language of the person we're yelling at, they don't notice that. So when I coach these individuals, I can't teach them social and emotional intelligence and empathy. You need therapy to work through some stuff, but really what I'm there to help them understand is there are better ways to communicate and lead. You can get the same objectives met in a different way that doesn't cause so much harm. And, it's ultimately just kind of like, you don't have to fight anymore. You're a doctor, you've been doing, whatever it is, you're good. People think you're competent. Let it go.
I'm really, fantastic that the work that you're doing. And I'm wondering about the profile of somebody who comes to you Because the first thing, I guess, is awareness and recognizing that they are indeed a bully. And my experience is would be that recognition is probably not there. How does somebody get to the point of recognition and come to you to say, I need some help?
They don't come to me. They're forced into it initially. So the narrative is generally that HR has been trying to get the CEO to address the problem for a while. It hasn't happened. And that person, the bullier, has finally crossed some sort of line where the CEO finally kind of gets a slap in the face and says, okay, I'm willing to put some resources toward this. And so then HR is free to get them a coach to help. So initially they're forced into it. I coach the CEO about how to have the conversation about coaching. I require a consequence be in place because they've been allowed to act that way for so long. They need to understand that it's over. The organization's taking it seriously. So initially they're forced into it, but from there I do 360 interviews. I interview about 12 to 15 people that they work with and present that feedback to them. And that's a tough conversation. I actually read the feedback to them. It's generally about 20 pages. It's a rough one. And I'll get a spectrum of responses to that. For example, I'm coaching a woman right now who is mortified. She's like, I knew I was frustrated and lashing out, but wow, I'm so thankful that my boss is willing to invest in me to help me turn this around. On the other end, I have another client right now. He's not interested. He doesn't believe in the feedback. He thinks it's ridiculous. I'm not going to be able to help him versus the woman who's really owning it. So then, so I obviously have her intrinsic motivation now. She wants to change. She's not feeling forced into it anymore. She wants my help. So that's what happens.
Yeah, I can imagine you get thrust into situations where, as you say, resistance would build up towards the work that you're doing. Wow, that must be quite challenging.
It is, but I've learned to not take it personally. My job is to teach them some skills, and the employer's job is to hold them accountable to use those skills. And it's their choice. If they're not interested in changing or don't believe they need to change, then they're going to end up with the consequences that the employer put in place. But I know that I did my best. The employer knows that they did their best. You can't force somebody to own that feedback. They have to own it.
Yeah. And is there a light bulb moment? I guess the 360-degree feedback is probably a big motivator, but is there a light bulb moment?
Yeah, the feedback is for sure the light bulb moment where they're just mortified generally. But then I have a lot of light bulb moments throughout. So we go through this process of learning about fight or flight. So it's interesting that this seemingly very complicated behavior is really boiling down to fight or flight. And I lean on that a lot. So we talk about how their behavior is fight, which means they're anxious about something. What are you anxious about? And so just to give you an example, one individual I coached, he was annoyed by interns and the lower level people. He was frustrated that they didn't come to him and ask him questions. He was the CTO. And he's like, they just go down this path and they waste 3 weeks, building something that we can't even use. Why don't they come and talk to me? Well, are they fighting or fleeing? They're fleeing. They're not coming to you. Well, why? Why not? And then, maybe it's the way I respond, so if they make you anxious because you're frustrated by them and they show up in your office, you're fighting, you're reacting to them in an aggressive way, and it's causing them to flee. So if you want them to come and ask you questions, you've got to change your reaction when they come to see you. You've got to encourage them to come and see you, not be annoyed by it. And so that's a perfect example of the kinds of conversations we have. And it's all those little light bulb moments where they're like, okay, that makes sense.
So flipping this around, if you're the victim of the bullying, it can sometimes feel like a losing battle or an uphill battle. Certainly, where do you start? Is there something that somebody who's a victim of bullying can do directly with their bullier to try and resolve it amicably between the two of them?
Yes, so I would absolutely suggest taking some steps on your own before going to HR. So you could just say, hey, I'd like to talk about our relationship. I feel like you're frustrated with me and I'm not really sure where that's coming from, so that's the kind of conversation you want to have. Take ownership see if you can get them to maybe explain some of what they're frustrated by, and try to resolve that. But again, they're ultimately fighting for something that the target can't control, right? That this person's fighting for uber competence. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Are there things or ways that you can help this person achieve that appearance of competence that they seek? That's in your best interest, but not to say you should just placate them and let them act that way. So then if you do end up in HR's office, it's important to be able to say, I am having these issues and giving specific examples. And then to be sure to clarify, I've already tried X, Y, and Z, and it's just not working. And that's why I'm here in your office, versus going to HR. This person's picking on me. Can you help me? That's not a good conversation. So to show that you've really tried to problem solve first is going to be important. And then I'll just say this, I hate to give this advice, but if your employer is not helping you solve the problem, leave. That's my advice, because I have interacted with so many people who are just destroyed, and, just like it's often equated to a domestic violence kind of a situation. I mean, it's literally abuse. So you're not going to be able to change them if the employer's not interested in helping you. You've got to go.
Yeah, it can absolutely crush someone's confidence. And the great thing is that we're in a market today where, in the US and pretty much all around the world, that you can just leave. The options are there. So I really feel like COVID has exposed some toxic leadership. And I know from my personal experience, some of I come from the hotel industry, some of the hotels that didn't treat their staff the best are the ones that are having the most trouble now getting staff. So it's been a bit of a leveler in some senses.
Yeah, I've seen quite a bit of, I just want to say I've seen quite a bit of research that this great reshuffle is because of toxic work environments. Yeah. So Pew Research, for example, found that the number one reason people leave is a toxic work culture. Boston Consulting released some research that it had to do with pay and feeling disrespected, so there's, people who leaders who aren't paying attention to their people are the ones losing their people.
Yeah. And perhaps that's a good step forward for our, definitely it's a good step forward. I wanted to ask you a question that I ask everyone who comes on the program. The theme of the Grind Academy is lessons in life that are not necessarily taught at school. By the way, I'm very pro-education, just to put that as a caveat. I'm still studying, continue to study. But if you could go back, if Catherine Mattice could go back to pre-kindergarten and you had all the knowledge and wisdom that you have now, and there were 3 things you could change about the formal education system to be taught that you weren't taught at school, what would they be?
The first is negotiation skills, especially for girls. Speaking up for yourself, right? So there's lots of research that little boys are allowed to be more aggressive, interrupt teachers, things like that. And girls the teachers get after the girls more for those same behaviors. So that's number one. Girls need to learn to negotiate and speak up. Secondly, I think we need more lessons around resilience and confidence, life skills. We learn all this math and English and by getting grades, we're supposedly building confidence and self-esteem if you get an A. But I think it's become pretty clear that formal education isn't for everyone. There's a lot of other ways. I think we need real classes around resilience and confidence. And then maybe coupling with this, a life lesson that I've learned is just believe in yourself. Maybe that's the same as confidence, but putting your eggs in a basket and going with it. When I started this business in 2009, we weren't talking about workplace bullying. It was not a thing. And everybody I knew told me to leave it be. You should be a leadership coach or teach, be a communication skills trainer. That's what your company should be. You can't start a business around bullying. And I was like, watch me, I know it's a problem. I've read all this research that you haven't read. So I know it's a problem and I know I can solve it. And so that, just that real belief in something you're passionate about and not letting people talk you out of it is an important lesson.
Great answers. I think one of the greatest things about doing this podcast is that I get to meet people who are changing the world for the better, and you're using your experiences and your research and study to turn that into your life purpose and change the world for the better. So I want to say a huge thank you for doing that, and also a big thank you for taking the time out to come out and chat to me and share your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was, I always love to talk about things I'm passionate about. Thank you.
Thank you very much.